Hello and welcome to this video in which we'll be looking at a CAT 2020 slot 1 reading comprehension exercise. In this video, we'll be talking about reading of the passage. We'll be getting a better sense of understanding of how to read the passage, what information are we supposed to take away from the passage after finishing reading it for the first time. In a subsequent video, we'll be talking about how to solve this exercise, how to solve the questions of this exercise. So starting off, the first line of the passage is a good line. It's definitely a line that will help us immediately understand something about the topic of discussion, but it's not a comprehensive description of what the author is wanting to talk about. The first line says the word anarchy comes from the Greek anarchia, meaning contrary to authority or without a leader. So that tells me that this passage, the author has started to define the word anarchy, which means anarchy should have something to do with the topic of discussion. But we still don't know what the author is trying to tell us about this particular word. Then in that sentence, the author is talking about the fact that how it was used in a derogatory sense, in a negative sense. But then Proudhon flipped that sense of understanding. That's what's in the second sentence, where it says Proudhon argued that organization without government was possible and desirable. So from here, the author is talking about the fact that anarchy is not always a bad thing and is actually absolutely possible and desirable to live without a leader. And then the author is talking about evolution of the political ideas and how eventually with evolution, anarchism was ultimately seen as projection of both liberalism and socialism. So this is what kind of sets the tone for what the passage can be about. The first paragraph kind of tells us that the author is talking about anarchy and how its definition, its meaning, its perception in society as a form of government has evolved over the years. Next paragraph begins with the author saying, historically, anarchism arose not only as an explanation of the gulf between the rich and the poor, but also a kind of an explanation of what went wrong. So that first beginning of the next paragraph tells us that the author is going to talk about source of anarchism. Why did it begin? So it began because the poor, of course, wanted to explain why there is a big gulf between the rich and the poor. That means that the poor started distrusting authority, distrusting the leadership, that they are the ones who are stopping them from becoming more powerful as the rich. So that's how it began. Then the author starts to talk about the French Revolution. By the way, if you're not aware of the French Revolution, you should read a bit about it, that how did the French Revolution happen, why did it happen, what are the causes behind it, and what happened afterwards, because it's a very important event in European history and oftentimes referred to explain multiple different things. Like in this case, it is being used to make us understand a certain thing about anarchy, that how because the rich became richer, so the French Revolution happened, they overthrew their kings. But then the author goes on to say that after the French Revolution was over, the new emerging ruling caste actually ended up betraying the revolutionists themselves. So how anarchy didn't exactly result in a consequence that was desirable for them. Next paragraph, the author says the anarchists and the precursors were unique on the political left, which means he's talking about the political ideology of anarchy. And of course, he is talking about the fact that how they were inevitably betrayed by the new class of politician whose first priority was to establish a centralized state of power, which is the same thing that the author gave us an example in the French Revolution. And then the next paragraph talks about the ideology, continues on with the ideology of anarchy, saying that the ideology began as a measure to oppose leadership, and every different place that anarchy actually took place, every different part of history, that wherever anarchists rose up, it always had the same interpretation, that they saw the state as the enemy. State means the ruling government as their enemy. And it continued across 19th and 20th century. And why? Because, as we said, the gulf between the rich and the poor. And why it was again the state is because every state protects the privileges of the powerful. The powerful, of course, in today's capitalistic society are the rich. So how it became a tool for the state to support the privileges of the rich. That is what the meaning of anarchy became. So this is a very important side to focus upon. Then the author is, in the next two paragraphs, talking about different types of anarchisms. First, he begins with talking about anarchist communism, which argues that property in land, natural resources, and means of production should be held in mutual control by local communities. So because it's a gulf between rich and the poor that they are trying to bridge. So everyone should collectively hold property. It should not be held by one single person. And that will dissolve the notion of rich versus poor. Everyone, if they're collectively owning things, then of course no one is rich, no one is poor. And the author is calling it anarchist communism. And the state or the government will federate who gets to use the resources when, but no one truly owns it. Then the author contrasts this from state socialism, and which is opposing the concept of central authority completely. So communism does have a central authority which has got control over all the resources in a collective fashion, and they decide when who would use. And this is different from state socialism for some reason. Then the author goes on to talk about another branch of communism called collectivist, not communism, another branch of anarchism called collectivist anarchism, in order to stress the obviously desirable freedom of an individual or family to possess the resources needed for living. So there is an anarchist which believes in collectivism, that yes, everyone should be equal, rich and the poor should not have gulf, but then they do not oppose the owning of resources, that property can be owned, resources can be owned. So that is the difference between anarchist communism and collectivist anarchism. And then the author goes on to again elaborate on this further, that there are unsurprisingly several different traditions of individualist anarchism as well. One of them deriving from the conscious egoism of German writer Max Stirner, where egoism means self. So individuals can have authority, they can own things. And these thinkers differed from free market liberals. Of course, free market is a term associated with capitalism. How they were different from capitalism is that in their absolute mistrust of American capitalism and in their emphasis on mutualism. So they were against capitalism, not like free market liberals. And they emphasized mutualism still. That yes, some things can be owned individually, but then other things have to be mutually shared. So this was what individualist anarchism is. So the last couple of paragraphs talking about different branches of the concept of anarchism: communist anarchism, collectivist anarchism, and individualist anarchism. So all these are the main points that the author is trying to make about the governance style of anarchism. So overall, language is pretty easy, but there's a lot of points that the author is trying to make. First, the author is trying to define what is anarchy. Then the author goes on to talk about how did and why did anarchism as a concept begin? Historically, what did it always lead to? Anarchist revolutions, how did they end, and how they did not always end in favor of the anarchists. Then the author talks about the ideology, specifically what all things do they believe in or don't believe in, and the different branches of anarchy. So multiple points about the topic of anarchism has been discussed. So we have to read the passage very carefully, because even if one paragraph I do not concentrate well enough, I will not understand the entire essence of what the passage is about. Now the passage's word count is 496, about average length as far as characters of paper is concerned. The passage, of course, is analytical. It's an analysis of what anarchism actually means. And it's been taken from a book. And textbook related passages are always going to pack in a lot of content, because textbooks are meant for instructional purposes, for classroom reading, not for leisure reading. That's why this passage seems a bit heavy. It seems a bit packed with too much amount of information, because it's been picked up from a textbook. I would say the ideal time to read can be about 3 minutes, because for a lot of us, anarchism and government ideologies might be an absolutely new thing that we are being exposed to by this passage. And that's why we might take a lot of time to ingest all the information that's been given to us about this topic of discussion. I would say up to 4 minutes. Even if you take to read a passage like this, that's acceptable. It's a lengthy passage. In fact, CAT 2020 paper was a lengthy paper as far as VRC was concerned. So 4 minutes, I would say, is an acceptable time to read as far as this passage is concerned. Overall difficulty level, I won't call it easy at all, because there's too much amount of information about an absolutely new topic of discussion for most of us. So I would say it's a moderate level difficulty passage. And a few things that I want everyone to know about is basic meanings of terms like socialism, communism, free market, liberalism, capitalism. Multiple times in different reading comprehension passages across the years, we have come across terms like this. So at least in a general sense, what do these different ideologies of governance actually mean? Even if you don't read about its critics and we start supporting one over the other, at least a broad strokes of what these mean can help us understand a lot of passages much more easily. Right. So stay tuned for a subsequent video in which we'll be talking about the questions and solutions of this exercise. Thank you.